So my talk is about the hybridization of non-state armed groups, by which I essentially mean criminalization, but finding a less politically or ideologically loaded term. What drives the fact that a growing number of insurgent groups, extremist groups, are also part criminal? Yeah, let me perhaps just start by through this observation that regardless of their ideology, really growing number of non-state armed groups, whether the Taliban, Hezbollah, the FARC, as we just heard about, the Tamil Tigers, again the PaCCS, whether they're leftist or Islamist or ethno-nationalist, a growing number of these non-state armed groups have also engaged in the production, the smuggling of drugs, sometimes just merely aligned with gangs, all whilst challenging states and creating alternative orders. A good example of that trend is Hezbollah, to take another region as the focus of this talk. In the screenshot, you can see Noor Hazaitar, who is a Lebanese drug lord, who admits on Lebanese TV willingly of being a close ally of Hezbollah. What explains the fact that ideologically driven armed groups, which remain, I would argue, ideologically driven in many respects, also engage in a measure of organized crime. In the case of Hezbollah, Hezbollah has been found to be involved in the smuggling and the production of Captagon in Syria. So let me right away dive into the literature that addresses that question, the crime-terror nexus, but also its critics. The crime-terror nexus sheds light on this hybridization of non-state armed groups by essentially pointing to an important trend, which has been the decline of external sponsorship for rebel and extremist groups in the post-Cold War era. That's an important point, and Makarenko and others have pointed to the ways in which these groups have sort of compensated for the loss of their income through the use of organized crime and criminal activities. Other scholars have also pointed out that criminals increasingly, allegedly, ally with criminals and rebels ally with each other in order to undermine, if not completely overthrow the state. But this whole strand of literature has been also criticized. Some researchers have suggested that this is a strand of literature which is based on essentially desk research with big picture analysis, very little ethnographic research, and that's an important point. Others have, I think, also rightly argued that the prospects of long-term, almost ideological alliances between criminals and rebels are vastly exaggerated, that the actual numbers of such alliances is quite reduced, and that often they tend to be more short-term and pragmatic. But I think another line of criticism is that the crime-terror nexus, for all of the benefits it has brought to research and scholarship, really focuses on the why this hybridization happens, as opposed to the how does it actually happen on the ground. So how does hybridization happen, and with what effects? As I said, there's a growing body of research that engages with that question. And three variables have been identified as fueling this dynamic of hybridization or criminalization of non-state armed groups. Some scholars point to conflict intensity as an important variable, arguing that the lower the conflict becomes, the more opportunities there are for armed groups to engage in other activities than just fighting. Other scholars have argued that ideology matters, and that some ideologies in particular, and I suggest that I assume that Martin might agree here, some ideologies provide opportunities for the justification in the involvement in organized crime. And yet other scholars have shown through statistical models and case studies that the control of territory is an important predictor of whether a non-state armed group will engage in organized crime, because as a rebel, insurgent, terrorist group sizes territory and wants to gain legitimacy in many cases by providing services to local populations, it does need that additional stream of income, and there are opportunities where the state has a very low presence by definition in rebel-held areas. These are all important factors, but in the rest of the talk, I just want to focus a little bit more on a variable that is a little bit more overlooked, and it's really the role of organizational dynamics, the role of intra-group dynamics. My research looks at how Islamist rebels engage in organized crime, and what I do find is indeed the importance of intra-group dynamics. They matter really a lot. And to think about it in that way, Islamist groups, but I think also more broadly speaking, rebel groups are often characterized in the literature as sort of unitary actors, in the media as well, in popular perceptions. But what I found in my research, what other research also suggests, is that they are deeply heterogeneous actors. People join them for very different motivations, for very different reasons, and as a result, different people in the organization will have different levels of ideological commitment. Some will join out of opportunities, and they will try to draw the group in organized criminal activities. So what I really shed light on in my research is how organizational dynamics drive hybridization. I'm aware that all of this is a bit abstract, perhaps, so let me give you an example before wrapping up. The example of Tawhid, which I talked about in my latest book. Tawhid was an Islamist armed group that controlled Tripoli, the city of Tripoli in Lebanon, during the civil war of the 1980s in Lebanon. And one of its factions in particular was made up of gangsters who were involved in the drug trade. Now, of course, that is contrary to Islamist ideology, the sale and consumption of drugs, of hashish and other types of drugs. But that faction was welcomed in the midst of the group because it, of course, brought it massive revenues. And as this faction continued bringing an income and as a result became powerful in the group, it dragged the group down in criminal activities, not just the smuggling of drugs, but a range of other criminal activities and tit-for-tats and assassinations and murky dealings with intelligence officers. This was, again, beneficial in the short term because it brought the group massive revenues through which it was able to govern Tripoli for 3 full years. But it also led to violent internal struggles and to a number of splits. So it's important also considering the long-term effects of hybridization. So what are the takeaways here? I guess that research has increasingly shown that non-state armed groups in some cases get criminalized or hybridized. There is growing research into the mechanisms that drive that trend. It's a very interesting body of research, but it tends to overlook micro-level ethnographic research, which I think more of which is needed. And here, although the control of territory, conflict intensity all matter, I would suggest that a focus on internal dynamics and how they play out is absolutely crucial as well. Because hybridization brings revenues to these groups, but it can also trigger splits. Thank you very much.